independent Sri Lankan youth organization dedicated to enhance political literacy and foster an exclusive and inclusive society through liberal democratic values. With over 1,600 members, it promotes liberty, individualism, rule of law, tolerance, and peace. The recent initiative of the digital course on the value for a better life and a nation exemplifies their mission. This movement has hosted a series of webinars ranging from cybersecurity to political literacy, aiming to create a more politically literate and engaged generation. We request all of y'all to hold your questions until the end of the session, where the floor will be open for a Q&A session. And please make sure to stay with us till the end of the session, as the attendance will be marked towards the end of the session for the distribution of certificates. And today, it's my distinct honor to introduce the speaker for today's evening, Ms. Subhashini Abhay Singha, who is a true luminary in the field of economics, specializing in international trade and the Sri Lankan economy. With a stellar academic background that includes a master's degree in international law and economics, Ms. Subhashini has commenced her reputation as an expert in trade policy, regional trade agreements, and economic development. As the Director of Research at Verit Research in Colombo, she leads groundbreaking research and strategic initiatives. Her insights have been invaluable to major organizations such as Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. Ms. Subhashini's data-driven analysis of China economic engagement in Sri Lanka is definitely a testament to her expertise in the field. Without further ado, let me invite Ms. Subhashini. Over to you, madam.
Hello. Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. So I think the topic given by the organizers to me is export transformation, a path forward. So the topic itself suggests somehow Sri Lankan exports are not at the right place, and it requires transformation. We need to change what we've been doing in the past. And we know why are we focusing on exports? We all know exports are critical to generate foreign exchange. And as a country, as citizens, we've experienced the pain of not having enough foreign exchange to even meet our basic requirements like coal imports, gas imports, pharmaceutical imports, which basically made us realize how important earning foreign exchange is. And also today's economic crisis we are in, that started from a debt crisis, also tells us that we can't forever be on a borrowing path for foreign exchange. So we've been borrowing foreign exchange without investing in expanding avenues to generate foreign exchange. And that is one of the many reasons that also contributed to today's crisis. And many of you may have heard about the debt restructuring. We're restructuring debt, but that is basically getting some breathing space. One fine day, we have to pay back this debt. And during this time, therefore, there is enormous need to focus on generating foreign exchange, and exports is an important area to focus. So let me share my presentation. I hope you can see my slides. Can someone confirm whether you can see the slides?
Madam.
Okay. So a path to economic recovery definitely requires us to work on exports. Why are we worrying about exports? Is Sri Lanka's exports actually have been declining as a share of GDP from around 30% when at the beginning of this century to almost 15% by now. And our exports have been growing at less than 2%. And we are basically, our export basket is no longer competitive. And as a result, our ability to generate foreign exchange through the current basket remains very low. So that is why we need to transform exports. But export transformation is a very vast area. And it's not possible to cover all the aspects of it during a short period, like half an hour. So what I'm going to do is in the next maybe 25 minutes to quickly take you through some of the key elements a country like Sri Lanka should focus on when we are thinking of transforming Sri Lanka's exports. So basically, there are two elements. One is local conditions, and the other one is global conditions. What do I mean by local conditions? It is about policies that enable firms to compete globally and respond to shifts in global trading environment. And it has to basically be very cognizant of what is happening in the global trade environment, what opportunities or challenges emerge with the shifts taking place in global trade. So it is a marriage between the two that will help a country transform its exports. So let me take you through a few examples to demonstrate why it is so important and what Sri Lanka can do differently from what it had done in the past. And I'll start with the global developments, and I'll tell you one example of a major global development that Sri Lanka totally missed to capitalize, whereas most of our neighbors, especially those in East and Southeast Asia, benefited from, and which enabled them to accelerate their exports rapidly. And then we look at the current and the future and see what are the major shifts that are taking place in the global trade environment that Sri Lanka needs to pay attention today. So lessons from the past, right? So one of the things that actually in the last 3 to 4 decades, global trading environment went through a massive shift with what we call the global value chains, right? So maybe most of you have heard what happened is the way firms manufacture products changed. For a long time in the 20th century, what firms did is they manufactured a large part of their product in their own country. But with the global value chains, actually, manufacturing basically got sliced across large number of countries. You may have heard of this example of iPhone saying that it's manufactured in a large number of countries and assembled in China. And the same is true for most of the automobiles and electronic equipment, which are leading in this global value chain development. So basically, why it was possible? During this period, there was a massive reduction in trade barriers, and there was massive reduction in shipping costs with the containerization. There was massive improvements in information and communication technology, and we lived in a relatively peaceful, open world in the last maybe from 1990 to 2050, or 1980s to 2015 even, right? So these changes made it possible for firms to manufacture a single product in multiple countries as if they're producing them in a single country. And as a result, these products or parts and components of products that cross borders became a very prominent feature of world trade. And you can see how most of our neighboring countries have capitalized this in comparison to us, right? So we are hardly part of this global value chain, as you can see from the low percentage of Sri Lanka's exports that are in these three categories that actually make up a large chunk of value chain related trade. And this is just one example of a country that maybe you've seen, many people quote this example. We were talking about export transformation and we want to transform exports. You could see how this one single development transformed Vietnam's exports. You can see the light blue area in the Vietnam chart that in 1993, the electronic machinery products made, was very, very small in Vietnam, but you can see how large it is today. And that is exactly why Vietnam went from 3 billion to 335 billion export economy. And look at Sri Lanka. Even in 1993, apparel was the largest export. And you can look at the color combination and the boxes. You can see Sri Lanka has not seen any transformation compared to Vietnam. And this failure to capitalize on this global development and was one of the reasons that made Sri Lanka that failed Sri Lanka to transform its exports compared to Vietnam. So let's come to the present, right? Actually, even we are living in a world where the global trade is going through massive changes, right? So what we need to ask ourselves is Sri Lanka going to repeat its past mistakes, or are we at least now going to make use of the new opportunities? So there was an article I read saying we live in a world of predictable unpredictability. Actually, today's world is going through massive changes, and these changes are reversing many of the factors that led to emergence of global value chains. It is actually so one of the major challenges that the world is facing, climate change, and as climate change becomes a very central focus of the world, that will eventually affect global trade, because you are demanding international traders and firms to be a lot more cognizant of their impact on climate change. An aging population, you may have already heard of the West going through a massive problem of aging. They are late. Why is it a concern? Because that means very high labor shortages and high labor costs. And again, that affects significantly production, your ability to produce products. Then the geopolitical tensions that are getting worse every day. It started initially with the US-China trade war, but today it has escalated and has become, as the relationships between the West and China and Russia has deteriorated significantly over the years. And you don't see this trend reversing. And that is why we are saying we are maybe in a new second Cold War. Now, that all of this has led to reversal of a lot of things that led to the emergence of global value chains. Everybody is increasing protection. You may have heard of very high tariffs being imposed on especially goods made in China or products made using Chinese inputs. And then you have geoeconomic fragmentation, because now the security concerns and other technology competition is making the world fragmented into different trading blocks. And then we said it was the information and communication technology that made a massive change in global trading landscape. And today we are moving from ICT to artificial intelligence. So we live in a world that is going through many changes, and all of this affects international trade. So I'm going to take two examples of how these changes affect international trade and what opportunities are there for us. With the geopolitical tensions and economic sanctions and increasing trade barriers, the West has imposed on China. Most of the global firms that are dependent on China as the center of their supply chains, China will emerge as the factory of the world in the last maybe 2 to 3 decades. Now these global firms are struggling to maintain their supply chains because reliance on China has become a high risk. Now they're trying to diversify their supply chains. They want to go for a China plus strategy because they realize it's too risky to have too many eggs in one basket. Where are these global firms going? Actually, they're going to neighboring countries. These are some of the countries that are benefiting significantly from the current geopolitical tensions. these large firms from Samsung to Apple to Mercedes-Benz to all of these large companies, Toyota to Nissan, all of them are now trying to find places to diversify their production and diversify their sourcing. Unfortunately, Sri Lanka is not in this map. Sri Lanka is not one of the countries that has been identified by any of these articles as a potential country, identified by these investors as a place they want to go. And this is extremely unfortunate. Then the second one is global firms are in search of opportunities to become greener and cleaner, because increasingly the world is bringing in mandatory rules and regulations and demanding greater compliance from the firms in terms of reducing their negative impact on the environment. Now, that means firms want to locate at places that allows them to become greener and cleaner. And this is just one example. Vietnam is definitely a very attractive place, but even in Vietnam, investors are being concerned because they feel, oh, we want to be green and we want to be using clean energy, but Vietnam is struggling to sort of expand its renewable energy share in their energy production. And then there is, we all know export processing. So industrial parks have been one major source of exports in every country. Traditional industrial parks did not pay a lot of attention to environmental sustainability, but today we are moving away from traditional industrial parks to what we call eco-industrial parks, because countries realize companies are looking for places to reduce their carbon footprint. And there was one research article that said that eco-industrial parks used in the world was less than 50 at the beginning of the century. But today the number has increased to over 250. But Sri Lanka doesn't have a single eco-industrial park. So these are opportunities that we have. And it is very important for us to, if we want to transform our exports, be able to respond effectively to these changes. So a lot of people, we live in a world of major power rivalry. And there is a saying that says, when elephants fight, some say grass gets trampled or ants get trampled, right? So when these little ants to me are the Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, these countries, when the world was very peaceful and when China, United States and the West was trading with each other, investing with each other, actually these ants benefited. And a lot of people were wondering, will these ants die now because these two elephants are fighting? But what you will see when you look at East Asia is actually, no, they are thriving, even in this environment of intense geopolitical tensions, despite enormous challenges. These countries seem to still benefit. And what we need to ask is, Sri Lanka, are we going to be a bystander? So that brings me to the next most important part. How we can effectively respond to these global developments depend on local developments. The world is going through a challenging period, so is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is going through an economic crisis like no other it has seen since independence. So it is going through enormous challenges. And as a result, we are overly focused on firefighting, debt restructuring, increasing our tax revenues. But we have to think beyond short term, because none of these global opportunities are going to wait for us. Just like we missed the bus in the previous cycle, we're going to miss the bus if we don't act fast. So we can't be overly focused on firefighting. We need to also have a medium and a long-term strategy, a growth strategy for Sri Lanka. In this strategy, creating this enabling environment for Sri Lankan firms to succeed in international markets remain a critical pillar. And I will give you two examples where Sri Lanka can work on, should work on. And our failure to work on these has been one of the reasons why we missed many opportunities in the past. One is cutting red tape at the border. When you are talking about international trade, any firm that is importing or exporting has to go through multiple government agencies, obtain a lot of permits, a lot of approvals uh, to engage in international trade. And this can be a nightmare. It can all these complicated processes, lack of information, officials, all of this adds to your cost and time of doing trading and affects your international competitiveness. There are simple ways to tackle this, and we call the trade facilitation is a term going to address all of these measures a country can take to cut red tape. You simplify your processes, automate them, standardize them, harmonize them, and you increasingly make available the information online. However, Sri Lanka has been very bad at cutting red tape at the border compared to our neighbors. This is just an example. One of the sources of data that allows us to compare countries is this World Trade Organization's trade facilitation database, because World WTO members have signed to an agreement called World Trade Facilitation Agreement. Many countries have to sort of tell World Trade Organization to what extent they have implemented trade facilitation measures, and as a result, it provides us a database. So this agreement came into effect in 2017. You can see some of our neighbors, even by 2017, had implemented many of the trade facilitation measures compared to Sri Lanka, which was lagging far behind. We were actually lagging behind developing countries in general, which had almost 60% of trade facilitation measures implemented. We were at par with least developed countries, LDCs, which were at 28%, and Sri Lanka at 29%. It has been 6 years since the implementation of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. Sadly, Sri Lanka has made less progress than least developed countries. And if we are going to continue down this path, we are not going to see any transformation in Sri Lanka's exports. This is just one example of a lot of initiatives, a lot of effort that had really not resulted in any meaningful outcomes. Automating and connecting board agencies so that traders can seamlessly work online with it. We started this process as far as early 1990s. But now we have had so many deadlines to complete this. And the most recent deadline announced by the government is 2030. In contrast, the world has moved far ahead. All of those dark green areas shows you countries that have almost 80 to 100% completed their single windows, their automation. And Sri Lanka is among one of the few countries who has failed to do so. So we cannot continue to do business like this if we want to transform the economy. And then one of the things that frequently makes Sri Lankans quite agitated is our strategic location, how the Chinese, the Americans, the Indians try to exploit us using our strategic location. I always say when I speak, I read a tweet on Twitter, somebody saying USA seems to have a plan for Colombo Port, China seems to have a plan for Colombo Port, India seems to have a plan for Colombo Port, does Sri Lanka have a plan for Colombo Port? That is the critical question we should be asking. Even if you compare to countries like Singapore that has really, world's leading maritime logistics hubs in the world, Sri Lanka has an advantage in the South Asian region in terms of proximity, distance, the short duration within which we can reach South Asian markets. And as global value chains shift south, away from China towards India, towards Bangladesh, we have an enormous opportunity to be a gateway to these global firms by providing the transport and logistics facilities. But the question we need to ask is, are we ready? See, it is strange that most of these countries have developed, have had national logistics master plans or policies over several decades. And Sri Lanka, you may have seen in many of Sri Lanka's policy documents, had stated we want to be a regional logistics hub, we want to be a regional maritime hub, but we've never had a national logistics policy in this country. And that is so sad. We have a very piecemeal approach. We will do a terminal here, terminal there, park, logistics park here, there, but not a holistic approach towards making Sri Lanka a logistics hub. So these are just two examples of opportunities we have, and some unique to us because of our natural asset and our location, which somehow we seem to continuously miss making use of. And another thing about being a regional player, what Sri Lankans need to say is, you can't become a global or regional hub with local players. A regional hub is a place where best in the world want to do business from and locate in. So to what extent our investment regime is open and inviting to these global players is critical. This is Economic Development Board of Singapore, and this is what they say. You can say they boast not about their local talent, they boast about how everyone in the world, the best in the world, want to be in Singapore. What better testament than to say they are a global hub or a regional hub? So we need to also change our mindset for always seeing the world as a threat than an opportunity. So I'll end there. I hope I am within my time. And thank you very much for the opportunity. Happy to answer any questions.
Yes, madam. Yes, and the floor is open for Q&A session. And I did see a message in the chat box. So it says, isn't Port City a regional or global hub?
Okay, so that's a very interesting question. So there are two ways to look at it. One is Port City does not allow manufacturing at all. So you can't have export-oriented manufacturing in Port City because it is entirely catering a services industry. Second is the current geopolitical tensions, and it aims to be a global hub, but within the current geopolitical tensions between China and the West, it will struggle. And it will struggle to basically shed the same fears that others have of being connected to China, in this entire global value chain business. But they're focusing on tourism and headquarter business. It is definitely, at least the company wants to make Port City a global hub, but we need to wait and see.
Madam, here, I'm Dhammika from Kandy. Can I speak now?
Can you hear me? I can hear you. Go ahead.
Right. Okay. Now, my question is about how to double the GDP. As you very rightly said at the beginning, we have a small timer window for us to improve our export revenue. Now, Sri Lanka being an agricultural country, our main exports are on agriculture. But like, if you look at even tea and even cinnamon, now what happens is majority of this produce ends up in the Colombo auction system where the producer won't get a complete price because the value addition is taking place elsewhere. For instance, in the desert, Dubai, you get the tea hub, not a single tea bush there. But, here in Sri Lanka, we have plenty, but we don't do much of value addition and export. Now, recently, I came across an incident where I find Sri Lanka is lacking in marketing standards, national marketing standards. If you look at ISO 9000, it clearly says how a marketing standard should be developed. Now, I had this discussion with the Institute of Marketing Sri Lanka, and they are also in agreement. And Professor Nalin Abesekar of Open University, we have had lengthy discussions with them. And in fact, the professor came to Sri Lanka Standard Institute, met the DG, and had over 1 hour long discussions. But apparently, there seems to be some problem that they don't understand. Will there be any possibility any organization come forward and support this initiative? Because even Karapincha and Rampe can be exported if there is some kind of support for export. As you rightly said, the business indexes, doing easiness index, we are still at the very low level. So Sri Lanka being, a very, very blessed country, which has high nutrient density in most of the products we produce, the taste is of paramount importance. Now that is why this re-export is taking place. In fact, our neighbors are taking the advantage of that. They send sometimes pepper seeds and then mix that up with our pepper and then export it, saying that made in Sri Lanka. Now, if there was a marketing standard, the standard would tell how to test the constituents of pepper, especially pepperine, at a ITI or any accredited lab, and then put that onto the label, so that it will have a premium price, and people will depend on. Say, for instance, countries like Sweden have publicly announced that they should consume only cinnamon produced in Sri Lanka. Other parts of the world, it's called cassia. It's kidney damaging. So the point that I'm trying to drive is, if somebody can come forward and speak to the DG SLSI and get engaged in convincing them to develop the marketing standard as per ISO 9000, I think we'll be doing more justice by our poor agricultural farmers, because they can't afford chartered marketeers with a small production quantity. So this is my suggestion. Please help if there is a possibility. Thank you so much. I'm Dhammika from Kandy.
Thank you, Dhammika. I think Sri Lanka's agriculture has a lot of potential untapped, but one of the main problems when I speak to exporters that they find, other than tea, is really finding exportable quality quantity throughout the year, whether it's fruits or vegetables or pepper or anything. And also that our productivity remains very low, and that some of the products do not meet export standards. So I think there is, and also I was talking about climate change as one of the biggest challenges the world is facing, and agriculture sector will be one of the sectors that suffers most from the climate change, with longer droughts and severe floods, right? So without today, when we talk about technology, I think while marketing is important, but if we don't solve our productivity problem and both production and quality and increasing the yields, we will not really be able to tap into the market because our costs remain high. And also predictability of our production throughout the year is going to be very low if we are not going to adapt to climate change and develop climate-resistant varieties. And if you take any agriculture crop in Sri Lanka, even tea, cinnamon, our production quantity we produce have been stagnating. And in others like rubber, coconut, it has been declining. So this is a sector that has a lot of potential, but sadly not sufficiently we are not investing at the right places. I've been told by one pepper exporter, for example, Sri Lanka's yield per hectare is like 500 tons, whereas Vietnam is around 2,000. So that shows the gap we have in terms of yields, and that makes Sri Lanka uncompetitive sometimes in these respective industries. But thank you very much. I think you gave a lot of answers yourself to the problems that Sri Lanka is facing. Um, uh, there are some other questions, Sashmita.
Madam, so I'm Ravindra here from Kadavata. One question I have is you discuss about Vietnam, India, China. So those the one factor I see with those countries like they have like largely populated countries like with huge population. So in comparative to Sri Lanka. So when we position ourselves, so some of the industries they need like a lot of labor and people to work on those industries. So Sri Lanka is a comparatively lesser populated country. So how we position ourselves, what sort of industries we should focus on, because when we compared with Vietnam or India.
So I actually, sometime back in a presentation, had this interesting chart because a lot of people seem to think the size, the resources, the population, the land mass, natural resources you have determine your export success. I had actually a chart that showed the top 20 countries in the world that account for almost 50% of the world trade. And among them were Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, tiny, tiny countries, no resources, hardly any population, but they contribute a lot to international trade. So what you need to understand is definitely that is one of the biggest problems Sri Lanka's exports have. That is a problem even in agriculture, because agriculture tends to be labor intensive in Sri Lanka. It doesn't have to be, but in Sri Lanka it's labor intensive. And apparel is labor intensive, tea is labor intensive. All of our exports are labor intensive. And we live in a country where we have labor shortages. We are facing an aging population. And unlike East Asian neighbors, Sri Lankan women do not get to work. You know, in East Asia, 60-70% of the labor force, the female participation in the labor force is around 60-70%. And most of the export sectors, female participation remains very high. In Sri Lanka, also in apparel and tea, female participation remains high, but overall as a country, having educated our women, we have one of the lowest labor force participations in the women participation in the world, 30%. So we have working women who are not working, and we are facing an aging population, and we are a small population, a small populated country, which means labor intensive, especially low skilled labor intensive sectors are not going to succeed. But sadly, Sri Lanka's export basket is heavily focused in low skilled labor intensive sectors, and that is a recipe for disaster. And that is what we are experiencing today. We have not seen the transition that other countries have seen when they move from low income to lower middle income countries, moving from more resource-based labor intensive production to more technology-based, knowledge-based industries. So we need to make that transition, and that transition requires a holistic approach. And most of the countries like Taiwan, Malaysia, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, that went through that transition did one thing that Sri Lanka is not doing, massively invested in their education. Even China, how they developed their sectors is massive investments in education, research and development, and significant alignment between education policy and economic policy. That is an area Sri Lanka has neglected.
Thank you, madam. Got it.
Yes, Miss. And there are a few questions in the chat box, and we would like to encourage all the participants to unmute and talk. There is no language barriers, so y'all can ask your questions in any language. It'll be great if y'all could unmute and ask the questions.
Hello, I am Bandula. Do you think that we are capturing the correct numbers of our export in terms of financial amount as well as the volume? I mean, volume, of course, you might be able to capture, but are we really getting the total export that is due to the country? Because we are hearing from various sources that, you know, there are a lot of other ways of, you know, parking our revenue outside of the country. So even our quantities might be okay, I mean, in terms of some of the export, but are we getting the right price for the correct amount to the country back?
So the simple answer to that is even if we double this, we will still not be generating enough foreign exchange. Our exports is around 12 billion, 13 billion. So even if we go to 26 billion, actually we are nowhere close to what other countries are doing. So there is a lot of accusations about export proceeds being outside. I doubt it. Simply, and even if there are reasons, that those are reasons we need to factor in, because at the end of the day, people are in business and they're looking for profits, right? But they have to bring certain amount of money back to their country simply to be able to purchase the raw materials, pay for their utilities, pay for their labor. It is, and we are not actually working in products with very high value margins. Apparel and agriculture products, if you ask any trader, they're working with very low profit margins. So to what extent they can run a business in Sri Lanka while keeping the money they generate outside is, to me, questionable. And how large the money that we keep outside.
Do you think, as we are a very small country, whether we can grow, be prosperous in by manufacturing and or agriculture? Because our land is very low. When we cut trees and clear the ground, then there's environmental problem. So aren't we looking at some side of a blind area? We are just, one sector says, okay, we increase the manufacturing and export. Then other sector says, so might be we'll have to have a lot of balance in everything, like BP operations, agriculture, manufacturing, so all sort of things, I think. But only thing Singapore is they mainly bring in goods, assemble and then dispose. So, but they have prospered. So what is your idea or advice?
So one of the things in Sri Lanka is we have experts in everything, and most of them are very opinion-based advice, right? They're not backed by data and research. A good example is the blunder we made with chemical fertilizer. So what's really important is, to make sure when we say we want to export agriculture and that we can be a prosperous country by just focusing on agriculture, to really ask people to back their information with sound data and research. So it's not just a developing country, but even, small country, but even large countries. Actually, as they develop, agriculture becomes a smaller share of their economy, right? So contribution to growth and employment. If you look at stages of development of countries as they become low, middle income, high income to high income countries, they actually need to reduce their dependence on agriculture as a source of employment and as a source of prosperity, because agriculture is enormously vulnerable to weather. Agriculture prices are very vulnerable to weather fluctuations, and it is very difficult for a country to have a stable foreign exchange earnings by entirely depending on agriculture. And agriculture tend to be low profit margin sectors. So as countries develop, almost all countries go to sort of technology and knowledge intensive sectors. Both manufacturing and services become far more important in their export basket as well as their economy. See, in Sri Lanka, the problem is actually agriculture sector contribution to GDP is very low, right? Around 10%. But our problem is our labor force survey tells us that around 25% of our population is employed in a sector that contribute to 10% of the GDP. That is our problem. That is why there is a lot of poverty, a lot of inefficiency, a lot of underinvestment in the agriculture sector. So we have not created employment opportunities in manufacturing and services sectors. And also today's manufacturing is very different, right? So from the manufacturing in the good old days, today we are talking about servicification of manufacturing. In manufacturing, things like intellectual property, things like brand ownership becomes very important. So you may be manufacturing a Mercedes-Benz, but maybe somebody else is getting the largest amount of revenue generated simply because they own the brand and they own the intellectual property. So we live in a different world today. So as a result, we can't think of this traditional manufacturing. And even when you talk about Singapore, Singapore is not only assembling. Singapore provides enormous amount of services to manufacturers. This includes financial services, insurance services, legal services, supply chain management services. Because when your manufacturing is cut across multiple countries, you need a lot of services to make sure your manufacturing process runs smoothly. And as a result, today's manufacturing has enormous amount of service content as well. And that is why countries like Singapore has actually benefited from being able to provide these services to the global firms.
Yeah, and the other problem in Sri Lanka, when you say manufacturing, we need power. So generation of electricity, either we'll have to go to thermal power, or because what you need, because Japan, because I have visited one of the Toyota factories, it's a huge area. All the parts come from different people. They assemble in the plant. So, but Japan manufactures electricity through nuclear power, but we cannot go for nuclear power. So then that's the other problem in manufacturing. You need electricity and water.
We need to sort of find, this is where I always feel you just need to create the enabling environment. Actually, the business community will find the opportunities. That's what other countries did. You create the right environment so that entrepreneurs, both local and foreign, can actually find the sectors, find the growth opportunities, and generate that export revenue. What Sri Lanka is doing is actually not. A lot of people say Sri Lanka has a scarcity of entrepreneurship. I feel like actually what we lack is an environment that encourages entrepreneurship, not that we lack entrepreneurs. It's just that we have an environment, the regulatory policy environment that discourages entrepreneurship. So that is what we need to tackle. And I feel, it's very difficult for a policymaker to say, go for this sector. This is the best sector. Actually, what the policymakers can do is reduce that red tape and allow the businesses to be able to make decisions themselves while providing the right regulation.
Yes, and we also have few more questions in the chat box, but I think Madam already answered few of the questions. So in favor of time, we request you all to only ask questions which have not been answered. And I came across an interesting question here in the chat box. Give me a second. Okay. It says, it asks me if the policymakers do not have a plan to play leadership role, how the organizations such as Chamber of Commerce trigger out to have one policy focusing on result-oriented move to a policy.
So I think private sector is part of Sri Lanka's problem and the solution as well. So when you live in an environment where basically your policymakers, regulators, and the government has a big say in how you run a business. You're basically, when you work in a very opaque environment, very manual, very bureaucratic, how you succeed in Sri Lanka from SMEs to large firms is through networks and deep pockets, right? You need to know right people at right places, and you need to have enough money to oil the palms to get over the obstacles you come across. And here becomes the problem. And somebody was saying, why can't someone go and do these things? So private sector needs to be also a voice promoting reform, encouraging reform, demanding reform. And someone talked about SLSI and standards. Private sectors can make a difference by actually engaging with policymakers publicly. But because of this network and deep pocket-led success, private sector, frequently even chambers, are reluctant to be openly critical of the government, engage openly, and they prefer to have closed room deals. Actually, most of the companies prefer to, instead of working jointly as chambers or associations, resolve their individual company problems through their networks and by throwing money at the problem. And as a result, one of the biggest problems that private sector has, if there are people from private sector, is they are themselves highly fragmented. They don't have a one voice. And when one private sector chamber or association proposes something, another chamber or an association opposes it. So that is a significant problem. So we need also, especially when policymakers have less motivation and interest, it is the private sector who should benefit from better business environment and lower red tape. So we need to see more unity and more professionalism within the private sector itself, which is something we need to work towards.
Yes. Thank you, madam. And is there any other questions?
Someone asked, I think, what is the right mix? I mean, it's very difficult for a government to decide what's the right mix of products and services. So you need, like I said, if you create the enabling environment, investors will come and find the right place. But I always say Sri Lanka's strategic location is the greatest asset Sri Lanka has. And if Sri Lanka needs to transition itself from a low-income country to a developed economy, it is really making use of our location and really being able to become a regional, true regional logistics maritime hub. We can generate enormous amount of employment, value addition, and foreign exchange. Dubai, Singapore are very good examples how their main reason for success is their ability to invest in that location and connectivity. It is unfortunate Sri Lanka, we constantly fight and worry about our strategic assets being taken by foreigners, while we ourselves are not making much use of these strategic assets. And we need to change our mindset. Even if Singapore and other cities, they were very happy to invite foreigners. If they can help bring better returns and better value to the country through their technology, through their expertise, they were open to bring them in, and they actually invited them in. Somehow Sri Lanka is constantly scared of it. And when we do bring in investments, we do bring in them through, without transparency, through unsolicited proposals, where we do not even know whether we are getting the best bargain, which is extremely unfortunate.
Just to add another, what about Maldives? Maldives, they don't have any for the manufacturing, agriculture, but still they are running the country with them they are doing. So whereas Sri Lanka, we have manufacturing, we can do tourism, but I think none of the things are getting progress as in other countries.
I think Maldives is an interesting country, but of course, a country that faces enormous challenges, right? Because they have fisheries resources and tourism, and both of these things are significantly challenged by climate change, right? They're at the forefront of sort of being exposed to rising sea levels and the climate change consequences. So I think it's not comparable. The challenges they have are far bigger than Sri Lanka. Actually, Sri Lanka has a lot more opportunity and potential. Maybe that's exactly what you said as well. But I don't think Maldives is, Maldives has definitely much more challenges than Sri Lanka face because its economy is entirely dependent on just two sectors.
Yes, madam. And I also came across one more question in the chat box. It asks the weaknesses and strengths of Sri Lanka to recover from the crisis.
I think there are many, right? So one of the major weaknesses, problems that Sri Lanka's exporters faces and businesses in general is policy consistency, right? I think in the last maybe 5 to 6 years, we've seen number of presidents, number of prime ministers, number of governments, and that means significant, massive policy changes. Policy consistency is critical for business to run business when your tax rates, when your tariff rates, when your regulations keep changing significantly every 2 to 3 years, even every 5 years. That is no place to do business. And that is one of the major reasons why Sri Lanka is not bringing in investments, which we definitely need to fix. Then, I think we spoke about a lot of strengths, right? Somebody had detailed information about why Sri Lanka, although we are small, although we have very little arable land, still we can do well in agriculture because of certain natural endowments we have that makes our products unique. And if we market them right, we can definitely bring in more money than we bring in today. And we have a decent level of education, but we need to, I think we are reaping benefits of investments in education done by people several generations ago. But today we need to really invest more in education, especially education that suits the current current economic and technological developments and challenges the world is going through. But we are not investing in education, and even the few educated people we have are leaving the country. So I don't know, I have a feeling that, the list can be so long, and political instability was a problem in the past few years. But we definitely have a lot of potential as a country. And one I clearly said about the location, regardless of current problems Sri Lanka has, even now we're getting companies are interested in investing in Colombo Port, right? So which means our location advantage has not gone simply because we are in a crisis. And tourism, right? We are still getting tourists despite being in a crisis. So there are certain natural advantages Sri Lanka has, but even in these areas, we are currently doing far below potential. That is the problem we need to fix.
Yes, thank you, madam. And is there any more questions? Due to the time constraints, I guess that we can have one more question. Is there any questions? And please unmute and talk.
And madam, one more question from my end. You say, so we see that some countries get foreign direct investments and they get like, so those countries get developed, like for example, Vietnam or Singapore. But in other ways, we see like countries in Africa, like maybe not recent investment, but so countries rich in minerals and oil, so they get kind of exploited, right? But the direct investments are there, but those all the profits are taken out of the country, but those countries are not getting anything, it seems. What's the difference? What differentiates those countries?
if you take the world, I think Africa is the most resource-rich country. Africa has the most resource-rich countries in the world, and some people say it is a curse of resources that is making Africa poor. But of course, Africa today, Africa, despite many challenges, are doing sometimes, I feel, better than us, many of the African countries. So when it comes to investments or anything, a regulatory framework matters. That's what I said about port investments. Also, when investments can come through without any transparency, politicians can decide what investors, if there is no proper regulations, if you allow investors to come in without any environment due diligence, without any respect for environment, if you're just bringing in investors because they are willing to pay you a higher amount of bribes than others, then obviously you're going to receive bad investments. The importance in countries like Singapore is the rule of law and proper regulations, transparency. That is what makes sure that you're getting the right investments. So in Sri Lanka, one of the biggest problems is lack of transparency, lack of proper regulation. And even when we are bringing in investors, especially for sectors where, as public-private partnerships, how it comes as unsolicited proposals. We are not going for international competitive bidding. We don't know how the investors were selected. We don't know what terms and conditions, and we get to know very late, and we realize we've entered into bad terms and conditions, but we can't even reverse because we will be taken to international arbitration, and we will have to pay heavy compensation for these investors if we go back on what we've agreed. So because whatever contracts we agreed with them are legally binding contracts. So that is a critical problem, and that is your regulatory framework, level of transparency, respect for rule of law, and levels of corruption are critical factors that makes a country's ability to benefit from investments or lose from investments. In Africa, I feel it is really lack of rule of law, lack of regulatory frameworks, high levels of corruption that leads to that kind of poor investments.
Thanks.
Yes, and thank you, madam, for sharing your knowledge and accepting invitation. Thank you, and we are very grateful for having you here. And yes, we do have some of the links posted on our chat box where we have up the social media links and the link for the certificates. So we encourage you all to go follow our pages on Facebook and Instagram so that you all don't miss any of the valuable sessions like this. And yeah, make sure to fill your name in the form so that the certificate will be provided. And also mentioning about the course which we have recently launched, it's an exciting opportunity and actually a thing that y'all can gain knowledge from. So y'all only regret the opportunities that y'all don't take, isn't it? So yes, go and do the course and be updated from our social media pages. And it was very nice to have you all as participants. We had around 115 participants. You all were so engaging. And yes, thank you very much for joining with us today. Thank you and good night.